Greetings of peace. My name is Yusuf Ismail and I am from the Islamic Propagation Center. And over the last few episodes, we have been discussing in detail the book of Genesis. The program you are watching is a bird's overview on the entire Bible, where we are basically unpacking, deconstructing, and looking at some of the pertinent and salient issues in terms of what is contained in the Old Testament. And we'll be obviously focusing primarily on the 66 books, that is 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books of the New Testament. And we are, or at least will be, concluding our assessment on the book of Genesis today. Now, here's the point. One of the issues we need to focus on, which has been raised in the past, is the age of Rebekah, which is obviously raised all the time when she married Isaac. This is contained in the book of Genesis. The age of Rebekah. Basically, in order to find the age of Rebekah, we had told that God essentially promised that Sarah will bear a child, and his name was going to be Isaac. And we told in verse 15, God said to Abraham, "As for Sarah, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai, her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will give you a son by her. I shall bless her so that she will be the mother of the nations, king of the people." In verse 17, we are told Abraham fell down. He laughed and said unto himself, "Will a son be born to a man who is 100 years old?" He was 100. "Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Verse 19, then God said, "Yes, your wife Sarah will bear a son. You will call his name Isaac." Going on to verse 20, "He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him a great nation." That's Ishmael. Verse 21, "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." When he had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up with him. That's in Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 to 22. That's from the NIV. So the above text tells us that Sarah was about 90 to 91 years old when she gave birth to Isaac. And according to Genesis chapter 23, the report in Genesis chapter 23, she purportedly died at 127 years old. Genesis chapter 23, verses 1 to 2. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. 127. Now, since Sarah gave birth to Isaac at 90 or 91, Isaac would have been around about 36 or 37 when the mother died. Does that make sense? She was 90. She died at 127. Abraham was 100 when Sarah was born. And that would also mean, strangely enough, that Isaac was about 36 or 37 years old when his father allegedly tried to sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. If you look at Genesis chapter 22, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to Abraham, "Here I am." Then God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you." Early in the morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey, whilst I and the boy go there." He calls him a boy, although he was 36 years old. "We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it upon his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham said. "The fire and wood are here, Isaac, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Now, why would he ask for the lamb for the burnt offering if he didn't know he was going to be the sacrifice? Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went together. When he reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. But the angel of the Lord, as he was about to sacrifice, the angel of the Lord came up unto him and said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son," which is not true, because Ishmael was also the son of Abraham. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram. In the thicket he took the ram, and the ram was eventually sacrificed. Now, at the time that Rebekah was born, Abraham would have been around about 30 to 36, or in his late 30s, just before the death of Sarah. Because 5 verses down, after Abraham and Isaac's incidents, the incident of sacrifice, we are told that Rebekah was born. Now, Rebekah was someone that basically was effectively married to Isaac. According to rabbis in ancient medieval sources, she was no older than 3 years old when she married Isaac. Imagine that. And the rabbis generally deduce this age using the biblical text itself. Rabbi Rashi, for example, points out in his writings and his commentaries that Rebekah was 3 years old when she was married off. Although Christian missionaries and modern day Christians dismiss this, Rashi was one of the most respected rabbis and came to the conclusion that she was 3 when she was married off to Isaac. Now here's a question. Why would an eminent scholar in Judaism of such a high caliber make the bold claim that Rebekah in the Bible, in the first book of Genesis, married off Isaac when she was 3 years old? And so when you look at the passages and the chapters and the verses that I've shown you, it clearly makes sense that she was indeed 3, or possibly extremely young, when she married off Isaac. As I mentioned earlier, Sarah died at 127. Isaac would have been 36 or 37 at that time. And subsequent to that, we have the sacrifice at the Mount of Moriah, which means Isaac would have been 37 years old. Immediately after that incident, immediately after that sacrifice, we are told in Genesis chapter 22, verse 20 to 24, sometime later Abraham was told, Milcah is also a mother. She has borne sons to your brother Nahor, Uz the firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Kesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And then we are told Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Milcah bore these 8 sons to Abraham's brother Nahor. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also had sons, Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Makkah. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. So straight after the birth of Rebekah, we find out the death of Sarah when she was 127 years old. Because chapter 23, Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. So this is a continuity. Rebekah was born. Immediately after the death of Rebekah, Sarah dies when she was 127 years old. That would put Isaac at about 36 or 37 years old. So some of the facts we read here is that Sarah gave birth to Isaac, hear it, at the age of 90. What's the evidence for that? Genesis chapter 17. Sarah died at the age of 127. Genesis chapter 23. The incident on Mount Moriah, the sacrifice in Genesis chapter 22, and the birth of Rebekah happened at the same time when Isaac was 36 or 37 years old, at the same time when Sarah died in Genesis chapter 23, verse 1 to 3. And the verses all to look together tell us that Isaac was 37 years old when Rebekah was born. The fact that Isaac was sacrificed in his 30s, not as a young child, but in his 30s, is well attested in all ancient sources and indeed amongst the rabbis. Rabbi Shimeon, from the 2nd century, he goes on to state in the Zohar, the Book of Enlightenment, translation and introduction by Daniel Shanan Matt, that Isaac was already 37 years old. Genesis Rabbah, chapter 55, verse 4, by Rabbi Abraham Cohen de Herrera, Isaac was 37 years old. Rabbi Rashbam, Isaac was a young man of 37 years old. You go on further. Yitzhak, Isaac, was at least 37 years old before Abraham heard about the birth of Rebekah. In the Targum of Jonathan on Genesis chapter 22 verse 1, you read the following, that Isaac was 36 years old. In the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges, we read the following, Isaac was 37 years old at the time of the sacrifice at Mount Moriah. And more recently, the commentaries by Adam Clarke in the last century, at least the 19th century, that at the time of the sacrifice, Isaac was approximately 33. He puts a much earlier date. The Kaufman's commentaries on the Bible agree with Adam Clarke's statement on Isaac's age, that he was probably about 33, 37, and so on. Lang's commentary on the Holy Scriptures, he was 34. The Gospel scholar David J. Ridges, Isaac was 37. Professor Jules Gleicher, Isaac was 37. The Associate Professor of History, Alonzo L. Gaskill, Isaac was in his mid-30s before he was offered as a sacrifice by his father. A new chronology for the Old Testament, Jan van Tale, it seems that Isaac was approximately 37 years old. So the above scholarly statements coincide and give the indication that Isaac was in his 30s at the time of his sacrifice. The conclusion in all cases is that Sarah's death was 127, Isaac was 37. So what is the significance? This is a question that I'm pointing out. What is the significance about Isaac being 37 years old when he went up on Mount Moriah with his father for the sacrifice? Significance is that Rebekah was born straight after Isaac and Abraham came down from the Mount Moriah. And Isaac was married to Rebekah when he was 40 years old. Did you catch that? And this is an important point. Genesis chapter 25, verse 20. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian, of Padaram, the sister to Laban, the Syrian. How old was Isaac? 40 years old. How old was Isaac when he was taken for the sacrifice? 37. How old was Rebekah when exactly was Rebekah born? She was born when Isaac was 37 years old. So what does that tell you? What does it tell you? Well, we'll come to that. That basically tells you that Rebekah would have been 3 years old at the time of a marriage to a 37-year-old Isaac. Is that child marriage? What would you consider that? Isaac marrying Rebekah at 3 years old. Let's look at A.K. Rashi, that's a well-known, respected Jewish scholar, commenting on Rebekah's age of marriage. And this has been retrieved from website, but it's from his commentaries. And I'll read the entire thing from you, from the commentary, Rashi's commentary on Genesis chapter 25, verse 20, where it says that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. He says, "For when Abraham came from Mount Moriah, he was informed that Rebekah had been born. Isaac was then 37 years old, for at the time Sarah died, and from the time that Isaac was born until the binding when Sarah died was 37 years, for she was 90 years old when Isaac was born, and 127 years when she died, as is stated above. The life of Sarah was 127 years old. This makes Isaac 37 years old, and at the time Rebekah was born. He waited for her until she would be fit for marital relations, 3 years old, and then married her. So if Isaac was 37 years old at the time of the sacrifice, and Rebekah was born after the sacrifice, and Isaac married her at the age of 40 when he was 40, how old was Rebekah when she married Isaac? She would have been 3 years old. Can you get that? 3 years old. And this is established in the commentaries and in the writings, and certainly in terms of what commentators put in terms of the age of Isaac at the time of sacrifice. Rabbi Tobiah ben Eliezer also confirms that she was 3 years old when she married Isaac. Isaac was 37 years old at his binding when Abraham returned from Mount Moriah. At that very moment, Sarah died, and Isaac was 37 years. And at that time, Abraham was told of Rebekah's birth. Thus, we find that Rebekah was 3 years old when she married Isaac. That's in the Pasikta Zutrata, Genesis 24, the Midrashic commentary on the Pentateuch by Rabbi Tobiah ben Eliezer. So Rebekah's young age is also alluded to in Genesis chapter 24, verse 57 to 59. The following verse corroborates with the previous evidence has shown that Rebekah was a young girl when she got married. She was so young that she needed a nursing woman with her when she was married off. Look at Genesis 24, verse 57 to 60. Then they said, "Let call the young woman and ask about it." So they called Rebekah and asked, "Will you go with this man?" "I will go," she said. So they sent their sister, Rebekah, on her way, along with the nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her. Now, if Rebekah was a grown woman at the time of her marriage to Isaac, as some have assumed, why would she need a nursing woman to accompany her? Do you get a nursemaid or a babysitter to accompany you when you're getting married? Do you do that? This very verse shows us that she was exceptionally young and not at an age when she could take care of herself. So, although Rabbi Rashi and other scholars have said that Rebekah was 3 years old when she married, in line of what the Bible says, one could possibly argue that, since dates and times were not too critical at that particular time in terms of recording, it's possible that she could have been much older. She could have been 6, she could have been 7, she could have been 8. But she was still a child. She was still a minor. And this goes to show that there is no age of consent in the Bible in terms of what the appropriate age of marriage is. In the Quran, there is an age of consent. And certainly the age of consent is a time in Surah 4, verse 3, which speaks about not just physical maturity, but mental maturity. The age of marriage is a test. You test them. When you find them mentally sound, that would be an indication, also a factor in terms of when you can marry them off. We find no such case in the Bible. Absolutely none. And here you've got a shocking account where if you look at the timeline and certainly the calculation of ages, it's quite clear and indicative that Isaac married Rebekah when she was 3 years old. Isaac was 40. It's clear, the Bible says us. He was 37 at the birth of Rebekah. Why can't missionaries see this? Why, when they attack Islam, when they attack the Prophet, why can they not see this duplicitous double standard? And that's a question we need to look at. An alternative in understanding this marriage, without discarding and obviously rejecting the entire Genesis account, is that there is a way maybe to understand this marriage without it being as controversial as it may seem. And that this marriage itself could have taken place. Isaac may have waited for her to hit puberty when he was about ready to consummate the marriage. And sometimes in ancient times, marriages may have taken place, but the couple wouldn't sleep with each other until later, until the other is ready and matured. And that might have been the case here, because the scripture tells us that Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to twins in Genesis chapter 25, verse 24 to 26. And that would mean that Rebekah had a twins born 20 years after her marriage to Isaac. That could have been a possibility that the marriage could have been consummated at that particular point in time. But all the evidence shows us, from the biblical perspective at the very least, that Isaac married Rebekah when she was 3 years old. This is a son. Isaac is a son of Abraham, a prophet of God. Marrying a child at 3 years old, what are the implications of that? So when a Christian missionary questions you with issues and problems that he allegedly suggests exist in Islam, you can turn it back against him tenfold, more particularly in terms of some of the crucial and critical issues and indeed inherent problems that we find in the book of Genesis. The latter part of the book of Genesis ends essentially with the story that you find the lengthy story, well, I wouldn't say that lengthy, but certainly a patriarchal story in terms of the book, in terms of the contents, in terms of what's contained regarding Joseph and his brothers. What basically transpired, the fact that Joseph was, his brothers deceived him. He was eventually sold into slavery. And the Joseph story is found in Genesis chapter 37, right up until Genesis chapter 50. And the story, though different in style from that of the patriarchs, continues the theme of the patriarchal narratives that somehow or the other God overcomes obstacles to the fulfillment of the promise. And in this case, you have the family of God is threatened by famine that could easily have brought all promises to a rapid end. And nonetheless, God somehow or the other preserves his people through near miraculous means. Joseph himself gives a theological grid through which to view the events of his life. And after his father's death, Jacob, the death of Jacob, his brothers worry that Joseph will now take vengeance upon them. And they thus approach him, asking that he spare their life. And Joseph's response indicates his awareness of God's guiding hands in the course of his life. And what does he say in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 to 20? He says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And so he reveals himself, in a sense, God reveals himself in the life and the story of Joseph to be a God in control of even the details of history. And so from a human perspective, it appears that Joseph falls prey to ill luck as he moves from Palestine to Egypt, and then from Potiphar's house to the prison. And his life seems determined to those who seek to harm him, his brothers and Potiphar's wife. But he knows that God at the end is the one behind the events of life, and certainly something that we can learn in life. And we find not too many differences with the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis to the story of Yusuf in Surah Yusuf in the Quran. Many similarities, and you can find that in many instances these stories essentially complement each other more often than not. A sign of providence, a theme that God overrules the wicked intentions of men and women in order to save his people, runs throughout the Old Testament, throughout much of what is contained in the book of Genesis, but more explicitly in the Joseph narrative, which you find also expounded and articulated in the Quran. There are other aspects in the book of Genesis which we find problematic. For example, Jacob wrestling God for some reason, or wrestling the angel of the Lord. Whether the angel of the Lord was in fact God or a representative of God is in fact a debate that essentially takes place. What I would urge all of you to do is read the book of Genesis. Study the book of Genesis. We scratch on the surface, but we've dealt with some of the key salient issues in the past few episodes in terms of what is contained. I would urge readers to get a copy of this book, a second edition, an introduction to the Old Testament by Tremper Longman III and Raymond Dillard. It gives you a general textual overview of not just the book of Genesis, but the Old Testament in general. It's a second addition to the introduction of the Old Testament. It integrates and interacts with the recent developments in Old Testament scholarship. There are several distinctive that set it apart from other introductions to the Old Testament. It introduces the book, introduces the authors. It has charts, graphs, and so on and so forth. And particularly in terms of the introduction, it gives an honest approach in terms of authorship. It gives an honest approach in terms of the Old Testament itself, the scope of the Old Testament, the theological perspective, and particularly in terms of authorship. It concedes the point that these books are inherently anonymous, that there is no a literary convention that assumes that Moses is in fact the author of these particular books. It very honestly deals with that. If you look at the introduction to the books in terms of composition and authorship of the book of Genesis, this is what it says. It says the issue of the authorship of Genesis is inescapably intertwined with the question of composition and origin of the entire Pentateuch. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it goes on to say that this issue is one that has severely divided conservative scholars from others. The focus of debate to be defined is Mosaic authorship. Debate, too, may be a strong word, though since non-conservative scholars quietly ignore those who still defend the traditional point on authorship. In fairness, it must also be said that conservative Christians have been too quick to distance themselves from the possibility of sources and too close to any evidence of significant post-Mosaic authority or activity. Nonetheless, because of the nature and importance of the issue, we will describe both the traditional, conservative and critical positions, attempt to capture the present state of the discussion. Now, this is a conservative book, and look what it says. It says, in a strict sense, the Torah is anonymous. That's what I've been saying at the outset. Nowhere do these 5 books explicitly or implicitly claim that Moses is the exclusive author. On the other hand, early Jewish and Christian tradition cite these books to him. On what grounds? On what grounds can we make the assertion that Moses wrote it? There are none. And as you can see, we've been dealing with anonymous books. There's another interesting book which you could obtain, A Survey of the Old Testament by Andrew Hill and John H. Walton. These are excellent books. This is a full-color 3rd edition on a widely acclaimed textbook that has been utilized in terms of study. Andrew Hill is the professor at the University of Michigan, professor of Old Testament, studied at Wheaton College. And John Walton is a professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College Graduate School. He's the co-author of several books. And this basically addresses background information, purpose, message, structure, and organization of the major themes of books of the Old Testament in detail. And so these are indispensable reading for students of the Bible. If you are interested in it, get yourself a copy of these particular books, and contact the Islamic Propagation Center for more information and material, both on a simplistic level and certainly in a more comprehensive level on some of the discussions and issues that we've been dealing with. So we've come to an end on the book of Genesis. We've discussed the salient issues, the critical issues in detail. We want you to go back, look at these episodes, study in detail some of the issues that have been raised, and utilize the information that we present to you in terms of engaging with other people. If you're a Christian, contemplate, look at some of these issues. This was not an attack, this was an honest appraisal, an honest assessment in terms of the book of Genesis. We will be covering in our next episode the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers, the book of Deuteronomy, until we give you an entire bird's overview of the Old and the New Testament in comprehensive detail, so that you can take the information that we present to you, utilize this information in your discussions, if you're a Muslim with Christians, and if you're a Christian, to contemplate and understand and maintain, of course, your interpretative relationship that you have with your particular scripture and the assessment that you intend making with the information that we are basically presenting. We have tried to be as neutral as possible. I've tried to be as open and as sincere and as honest in the assessment. We all come with our historical and traditional biases, but certainly the information that is presented is not information that I'm making up or sucking from the thumb. We are using the text, we are going through it with a fine tooth comb and letting the Bible, and as you have seen in the past few episodes, the book of Genesis speak for itself. So we wish you all the best. Until next time, I'm Yusuf Ismail, on behalf of the Islamic Propagation Center, and join us in our forthcoming episodes as we unpack, analyze, and look and deconstruct other books of the Bible. Till then, greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum.
الحميد المجيد الرشيد الشهيد اللطيف الخبير